listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, and Lisa Watson on buttons, on the buttons. And joining us on the line, I presume Dr. Horne is in California. Don't know for sure, but Dr. Horne is more than a regular on this particular show, and he is the author of numerous books, and one of his books is, I dare say, a Gerald Horne reader, and Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. And we'll be talking about his upcoming book, I presume, during the interview. But I guess the first question is, how are you doing, and how was the Pan-African Film Festival?
Well, it's ongoing, the Pan-African Film Festival. That's PAFF.org in Los Angeles. Last night, I saw a documentary about Stephen Bingham. Recall that he was the lawyer that entered the prison in August 1971 that housed George Jackson. And that particular episode led to George Jackson being slain by the prison authorities, and Stephen Bingham went on the lam for 15 years, mostly in France. It was useful. One of the nuggets that came out of this documentary that I'll probably incorporate into, or I should say, supplement my book on Southern California, is that Stephen Bingham entered that prison on that fateful day with a Black woman legal worker by the name of Vanita Anderson, who actually I was familiar with, as I note in my manuscript, because she, like myself, has roots in St. Louis. In fact, her father, Robert Witherspoon, I believe his name was a crusading attorney who collaborated with William Patterson, the Black communist lawyer, who at that time was leading the Civil Rights Congress. And I used to run into her, Vanita Witherspoon Anderson, on the streets of Berkeley on a regular basis. Now, Stephen Bingham was at the screening last night of the documentary on his life, and I asked him about her, and he seemed to suggest that she may have been complicit in the slaying of George Jackson because, among other reasons, when Bingham was put on trial in the 1980s for his alleged role in the killing of prison guards on that fateful day in August 1971, that she was not called as a witness by the prosecution. In fact, her role has not been explored by the state authorities, even though a number of prison guards died on that day. And so it's a very curious episode. So that was one film that I saw last night at the Pan-African Film Festival. And I'm looking forward to seeing documentaries about Amiri Baraka, Max Roach, Diane Watson, who was a local Black woman politician here in the Southland. And I also saw a documentary last night on the Electoral College of the United States of America. That's this contraption that selects the US president, whereby you can win the most votes and still lose, as Al Gore in 2000 and Hillary Rodham Clinton in 2016 could well explore and tell you. And the documentary explores the roots of this electoral college in the battle days of enslavement. It's rather remarkable how when one encounters these stumbling blocks with regard to modernity in this country and moving this country forward, inevitably reaching back from the past or these entities like the Electoral College that have their roots in the enslavement of Africans. Something similar holds true with regard to the Second Amendment, which, according to current interpretations, allows any citizen to have an AR-15 rifle, perhaps even a nuclear weapon in their closet. And that Second Amendment was grounded upon this idea that the settlers, European settlers, had to be armed up to and including going to church on Sunday in case of an insurrection by the enslaved or an insurrection by the indigenous population. And it shows how the dead hand of the past is still governing our actions today. And once again, I make a special plea to our friends in Canada to help rescue us from this morass in which we now find ourselves by helping us to explore more fruitfully and accurately the rather entangled history of this so-called republic.
Now, we are raising funds, so we encourage everyone who is listening to these airwaves to go out and help us, donate whatever you can. And I wanted to ask you another question about today is going to be the Super Bowl, and many people criticize the Super Bowl because they basically talk about the Super Bowl is basically an American thing, whereas you have the World Cup and a lot of other sports events that are bigger than the Super Bowl. But I guess I have a thing about the Super Bowl. It's probably a subjective situation because I guess the first black person, one of the people that won the Super Bowl, the first black quarterback was Doug Williams. I never met Doug Williams. I met his brother, Michael Williams. So I guess I'm kind of subjective on that particular situation because, I know most people in my family really take a lot of pride on Doug Williams since he went to Grambling, Louisiana, and I had family in Grambling, and they knew him. So what are your thoughts on today's Super Bowl?
Well, I'm of multiple minds. First of all, the San Francisco 49ers have one of the best diversity hiring records of any professional sports franchise, which is fitting given the fact that they're cited in San Francisco, which generally speaking is the city that the right wingers love to hate for various reasons. And that's been turbocharged in light of the fact that turbocharged in the opposite direction because they're facing the Kansas City franchise, which is housed in my home state of Missouri, the name Kansas notwithstanding. And as you may know, the right wing is very hostile right now to Taylor Swift and her beau, Travis Kelce, the Kansas City star player, which has caused the right wing to now root for San Francisco, even though they are the epitome of a so-called woke sporting franchise, being celebrated for hiring particularly black coaches. And interesting, not the head coach, of course, but assistant coaches. And Harry Edwards, the 6'8" academic, University of California, Berkeley, roots in St. Louis, East St. Louis, Illinois, across the river from St. Louis, organized the 1968 boycott of the Mexico City Olympics, has also played a pivotal role in that process. He's been a amply compensated consultant to the San Francisco 49ers football team for years now. Now, of course, he's 82 years old. He's facing bone cancer with a rather dispiriting prognosis, to the point where he says he basically munches on painkillers, like some people munch on popcorn, which obviously is not good. So with regard to your question, I'm of two minds with regard to this football game, which of course is a commercial enterprise, $7 million per minute for a commercial, for example. In fact, many people don't watch the game as so much as they watch the advertisements. Which makes it prototypically a U.S. capitalist enterprise. And it may turn out to be the most heavily televised event in the history of this country. So we'll see what happens.
You have some questions, Melinda?
Yes, we have, lots on the deck. Do we want to talk about, I'm trying to, pronounce it, Medvedev of Russia predicts a new civil war? We didn't get to
Dmitry
that last week.
Medvedev, who is a former president of Russia, recall that for a while in the early part of the century, Mr. Putin stepped down from the presidency and was replaced. This was during the Obama years, which of course were 2008 to 2016. During a portion of the Obama years, Medvedev was the president. And he's now become a real hawk with regard to Russian foreign policy, and also with regard to his critique of the United States. And he was quoted for the proposition that the United States might be headed towards civil war. And actually, if you tune into Breakthrough News, which you may be familiar with, you'll see a clip where I echo what Dmitry Medvedev says, because on the Texas-Mexico border, things are spinning out of control. Recall that in 1860, 1861, one of the reasons why Texas went to war against the United States was because Mexico was not returning enslaved Africans who fled by the thousands into Mexican territory. Texas argued that the United States could not protect its economic interests. So it went to war, and Texas wound up being a bulwark of the so-called Confederate States of America, which waged war against the United States government. It was the Confederate state least damaged by the U.S. Civil War, but not least because during the U.S. Civil War, as you may recall, France had seized the opportunity to overthrow the Mexican regime and install a puppet regime, which then began to collaborate with slave-owning Texas. And so the idea was that even after the Confederates had surrendered in 1865, Texas and Mexico, French-dominated Mexico, in other words, would continue to wage war against the United States, up to and including making sure that enslavement of Africans would not disappear. That particular scheme ran aground, but subsequently Texas became a leader in terms of lynchings of Black people, a leader in terms of Ku Klux Klan chapters. And now, 2024, the worm has turned. And what you see is that Texas is now objecting because they argue that Mexico is a sieve, allowing not only Mexican nationals to come into Texas, but also nationals from Asia, Africa, the Americas, all over the world, coming through the Texas-Mexico border. And so this has led to overheated denunciations of the Mexican government. This is taking place in the context of a recently revealed reality, which is that Mexico has now replaced China in terms of a source for U.S. imports, a source for U.S. merchandise and goods. Now, to be sure, some of these items that have made in Mexico on the label actually have inputs from China. But still, this is a remarkable turn of events, and it bespeaks the declining relationship between the United States and China, the heightened importance of Mexico in terms of U.S. political economy. And I should also mention the other member of this partnership, so-called, between the North American nations, speaking of Mexico, United States, and of course, Canada, because the latest news out of the neighbor to the north is that because of the militarization of the Texas-Mexico border, those seeking to enter the United States from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia are flying into Canada. And then crossing the northern border, which is largely not militarized, largely not protected, quote unquote, by men with arms. Now, speaking of the latter, with regard to the point about a new civil war, you have a standoff between the U.S. government authorities, the Border Patrol, and Texas state armed men. Other conservative states like Idaho have sent their armed men to the border. You have right-wing truckers, not unlike the right-wing truckers who were causing so much disarray in Ottawa during the height of the COVID pandemic because of COVID restrictions. Right-wing truckers have descended on the Mexico-Texas border, along with inflamed Christian evangelicals, speaking of the army of God. So it's a very dangerous situation. And the governor of Texas, speaking of Governor Greg Abbott, he recently returned from a foreign tour where supposedly he was trying to gin up investment in Texas, but there are those who suspect that he's trying to gin up political support for secession of Texas, for Texas to become an independent country once again, which it was between 1836 and 1845 when Texas seceded from Mexico because Mexico had moved to abolish slavery and the president of African descent, speaking of Vicente Guerrero. Now, you should also know that presidential hopeful Nikki Haley has made comments suggesting support for secession as well. And there might be, as I may have mentioned previously, a measure on the ballot in Texas that would allow the citizenry to secede, to vote to secede from the United States and form an independent country. So once again, it's a very delicate situation. Go to Breakthrough News and you'll see a longer analysis that I provide.
Now, could you, just go back to Russia for a second, could you talk about Tucker Carlson's interview with Mr. Putin?
Well, this is part of the ideological split in the U.S. ruling class. Tucker Carlson, formerly of Fox News, now affiliated with Elon Musk on X or Twitter. He was able to bag a 2-hour interview with President Putin. And this has the opposite wing of the U.S. ruling class very upset, coupled by the fact that just yesterday at a rally in South Carolina, Mr. Trump, the presumptive nominee for president in 2024 on the Republican ticket, expressed disdain for the European members of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And I think Canada should pay attention as well, because he suggested that unless the other members of NATO pay what amounts to protection money to a Trump government, he will step aside, if not encourage Russia to attack these other members of NATO. Now, I don't think that Russia will necessarily do the bidding of Mr. Trump, but what it bespeaks is this fundamental rift with regard to the U.S. ruling class, with the Biden-dominated wing still all in on helping to finance the Ukraine conflict with Russia, and Tucker Carlson, Mr. Trump, willing to pull the plug. And this has led to a lot of sniping between and amongst the various wings of the U.S. ruling class. And what I find particularly troubling is that if somehow Mr. Trump manages to return to the White House, which you cannot rule out, that even our friends on the left will not do an analysis to explain this phenomenon. They'll resort to talking about how Mr. Biden is 81 years old and is subject to memory loss, which of course is all true, but I'm not sure if that's a sufficient explanation to undergird why Mr. Trump is ahead in the polls and may return to the White House. I think what's remarkable about the United States is that even people who say that they have a class analysis, they don't do a class analysis when it comes to U.S. politics, because they don't want to examine why so many in the Euro-American working class and middle class support Mr. Trump. And so therefore they don't do a class analysis. It's really stunning. It's really remarkable. And certainly, as I've said before, despite all of this talk in recent days and weeks and months about settler colonialism in historic Palestine, there's hardly an analysis of settler colonialism in North America, particularly in the United States of America. I might have mentioned that a scholar who actually I respect, Caroline Elkins of Harvard, her book on the Kenyan liberation struggle is worth reading, but she put out an edited volume on settler colonialism, looking at that phenomenon all over the world, except the United States of America, which is quite stunning. It's like putting out a book on racism in the United States and ignoring the existence of Black people, for example. So all of these contradictions are now coming to a head. That is to say, the failure to do a class analysis, the failure to do an analysis of settler colonialism, which may serve to explain why descendants of the settlers tend to be more right-wing, which is something that our friends on the left studiously avoid analyzing. But it's all coming to a head on the first Tuesday in November. And as of today, things look rather bright with regard to Mr. Trump, which of course is good news for him because he either faces the prospect of being elected president or going to jail. Those are his two choices.
Another question, Melinda?
Yes, I don't know where we want to go from now. Let's go to, we want to talk about, we haven't talked about the unrest in Ecuador and Papua New Guinea.
Well, with regard to Papua New Guinea, which, as you know, is in the neighborhood of Australia and Indonesia, there was unrest a few weeks ago when we first raised this question. A lot of it had to do with police not being paid. Now, interestingly enough, this idea of police not being paid has also reared its head in West Africa. I just interviewed a U.S. national, a Black American who was in Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, and which has a reputation, for better or for worse, as being rather stable politically. But from his telling, he suggests that when police are not paid, which has been the case of late in Cote d'Ivoire, they basically just stick up tourists and also Cote d'Ivoire nationals to get money to feed themselves and feed their families. You find the same thing to a certain degree in certain parts of Congo, for example, where soldiers and police who are not paid, but then they have guns and they use the guns to extract funds from the unwitting. And that's basically what happened in Papua New Guinea. Now, Ecuador is another question. You've had the so-called drug gangs who are very heavily involved in prison culture, and they were in rebellion at a particular prison. In fact, during one episode, they entered a television station while broadcasts were taking place, and for a while held the commentators hostage on television. This is part of a general unrest in this hemisphere, which in turn ties into our earlier story, because that's driving people to the Texas-Mexico border, trying to enter the United States so that they can enter the labor force of the United States of America. And you see this in Venezuela, for example, which is lost by some measures about maybe 20% or more of its population, which is headed north, which in turn has inflamed relations between Venezuela and its neighbor, speaking of Guyana. You know that in light of the possible return to the White House of Mr. Trump, people like myself have been exploring the Bahamas as a point of refuge. But now stories emerge from Bahamas about a murder epidemic that's now unfolding on that archipelago. So what we see in Ecuador is of a piece with what's going on in other places in the hemisphere. Now, I haven't even talked about Argentina, where you have this madman, Javier Milei, just inaugurated in December 2023. Inflation is skyrocketing, protests are skyrocketing. He had the gumption to turn down an invitation to join the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which was madness of the rankest sort. His comrade across the border, speaking of Mr. Bolsonaro, evidence just emerged about how after Mr. Lula was returning to office a year or two ago, that Mr. Bolsonaro had plotted a coup that involved the arrest of members of the highest courts in Brazil as well. It's interesting to contrast how Mr. Bolsonaro is being handled with regard to his attempted coup and how Mr. Trump is being handled with regard to January 6, 2021 and his attempted coup, because Mr. Bolsonaro is going to be barred from running for office in Brazil, may even wind up in prison, whereas Mr. Trump may be returning to office. Now, would someone explain to me that contrast, particularly those who continue to make this argument that you had this grand revolution in the United States of America in 1776 that guaranteed bourgeois democratic rights, was a blow against monarchy and blah, blah, blah. Whereas the monarchy in Brazil lasted to the latter part of the 19th century. Slavery was abolished until 1888. And yet we have this contrast. So someone should explain this contrast to me and how it unfolded.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Could you talk about the elections in Pakistan?
Well, you know Imran Khan, who had been the leader of Pakistan, but he got into hot water with the Yankees because he had gone to Moscow and supposedly was seeking to emulate India, which did not, of course, endorse the sanctions crusade against Russia in light of the intervention in Ukraine. Well, the Yankees are now treating India differently than they're treating Pakistan, which should not be surprising since it's felt that India can be a cudgel against China, where it's difficult to imagine Pakistan acting similarly, given the close relationship between Pakistan and China going back decades, with a relationship that's as sturdy as steel, as sweet as honey, and deeper than the deepest oceans. That's how the two parties have described their bromance. So Mr. Khan has been detained by the all-powerful Pakistan military. Yet, in the recent elections in Pakistan, his party did quite well, even though the military had cleared the decks for the return to power of Nawaz Sharif, the former leader in Islamabad. They arrested his opponent, Mr. Khan. They allowed him to return to the country from which he had exiled himself or had been forced into exile. So the situation in Pakistan right now is very dangerous, made even worse by the fact that it's a nuclear-armed nation. So of all the headaches we have to pay attention to, we should add Pakistan to the list.
Let me say that we are in fundraising mode, so we urge you to support Diasporic music in particular, and Black Power 96 in particular, the station generally, and us in particular. And I would also like to suggest that this is African Liberation, Black Liberation Month, and I will suggest that everyone go and pick up a copy of Dr. Gerald Horne's Black Revolutionary William Patterson and the Globalization of the African American Freedom Struggle. Give that a read. How is that book selling right now?
Well, that book came out 7, 8 years ago, so I haven't really kept up with it. The feedback, the reviews were generally positive. The feedback has been positive. But, I dropped these 2 books in the last few months. One you mentioned, I dare say, a Gerald Horne reader, Acknowledging Radical History's Conversations with GH. And those are the books right now that I would recommend to your reading audience. And speaking of support for diasporic music, obviously, I'm in support of diasporic music. I'm in support of Black Power 96. I encourage and urge, all within range of my voice, to go to your website and make a secure pledge, or to call in and make a pledge, because the kind of news and views and music that you receive on this particular outlet, I guarantee you will not find elsewhere.
Thank you very much for that, sir. And I guess we will be hollering at you, speaking with you next week, sir.
All right, good luck to you. Bye-bye.
And I would like to thank Lisa Watson, Melinda Francis, and anything else you would like to add, Melinda?
Yeah, I'm just going to remind listeners to please go to blackpower96.org/donate. And if you're on the Cash App, Black Power 96, and any amount counts.
And we will see everyone in the whirlwind, and we would like to, we will be back next week, and we will be continuing our fundraising efforts. And